Peace be upon you. It is an absolute joy to be here. I have the distinct privilege of having two people in this room who have blessed me with a tremendous amount of experience and wisdom. All of it to do with faith, and all of it to do with different forms of education. Professor Lähnemann, I happened to be a student of his long before he even knew of my existence, which I think most students and professors would have as a situation, and whose presence in the orbit of Religions for Peace was a very strong inspiration for me when I first worked there, actually in 2000, some time ago. But I also have, and we are all blessed also, with Baha'i Sayyid Ji, who has been one of the most phenomenal religious leaders in the multi-faith space globally. And so between them, I think we have the academic and the multi-religious spaces beautifully encapsulated. And therefore, there cannot be any greater blessings. But I also want to give a shout out to my colleagues who have worked with me in these different spheres for so long, both at the United Nations, but also within the multi-religious spaces. I chose to speak today with due guidance from both Lähnemann's, because there are two, and the result was to try to see if we could focus a wee bit on the role of women in this space. But my presentation will be structured along three questions. The first is why resilience, why interfaith, and why peacemaking in this domain that we live in today. In terms of what I mean by resilience, I actually mean the courage to face what happens around us. There is no context in which we will not be confronted by challenges. And sometimes it looks as if the challenges diversify, and sometimes they look like they're exactly the same, but they are increasing, it feels like, in number, in magnitude, in depth, and in interrelatedness. We will always be confronted by challenges. The difference between confronting and surviving with courage and between confronting and resorting to violence as a means of coping is this resilience. But resilience is the ability to effectively, in my humble opinion, actually be courageous. Not just to be patient, not just to be creative, not just to avoid and try to live one's own life in peace, not just to take advantage of the multitudes of challenges in order to promote oneself or one's ideology or one's country, but effectively the courage to go against the trend. And that is not always something that many find possible or easy, and then therefore it is a form of resilience. In his seminal book, which I'm very much hoping we will all receive a copy of, and this is only a preprint copy, but one of his many tomes, Professor Lähnemann speaks about interreligious learning and peace education. He speaks especially of something which he calls the religious encounter as a perspective for teaching. And he maintains, in reference to other intellectuals who have spoken on this, he speaks about a thesis, many theses, one of which is the dialogical didactics of world religion, which we all need, but it is important for encounters that those involved are aware of their own religious traditions in a differentiated way. In other words, it's not good enough to be a good Muslim, a good practicing Muslim. It's not good enough to be a good practicing Christian and Jewish and Hindu and Buddhist, but actually be able to understand and appreciate one's own religion differently. And sometimes that differently requires some self-criticism, some constructive criticism. Either way, it requires a great deal of courage. Because especially within the religious educational realms, such as we know them around the world, it is far easier to go with the curriculum as it is set. It is not necessarily encouraged to question that which is set as learning, and it is even less usual that we would learn from a young age with one another, about one another, from one another. And this is precisely part of the pedagogy that Professor Lähnemann and many others have spoken to over and have written and have articulated over decades. What would it take to be self-critical about one's own faith tradition? What would it take to learn resilience through that ability to be self-critical about one's own religion and faith as it is taught? And heavens above, what would it be to be self-critical of our own religious institutions as they exist and operate today in a multitude of different formats? As a Muslim woman who has worked for over 30 years with many different faiths in secular contexts and in multi-religious contexts, I can tell you that the kind of self-criticism can often lead to tremendous isolation, because there are no allies, there's no alliances to be made in that space of self-critical reflection about one's own tradition. From one's own tradition, self-reflexivity is a sign of betrayal. From other religious traditions, self-reflexivity about one's own religious tradition is a sign of vulnerability, a sign of weakness, a lack of clarity, etc., 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 especially if it is undertaken by a woman. So most of the women who have had tremendous experience in the multi-faith world have had to build their resilience, per definition, to simply exist in that space. Because even though it is multi-faith and everyone is supposed to be an equal, it is actually a deeply judgmental space. It is a space where there's very little room to be self-critical, let alone critical of other traditions. And in that respect, it reminds me quite a bit of some of the secular governmental spaces where it is okay, indeed it is healthy, to be critical of other countries, other nations, other cultures, other ways of doing things. It is absolutely not okay to be self-critical about your own way, your own government, your own culture, etc., etc. As we build our resilience, it therefore requires a remarkable amount of courage, because one has to compete and contend with different forms of loneliness. Again, from within your own faith communities, but also from other faith communities. I recall very clearly speaking to a former Secretary General of the United Nations from my own country, the only one who was never given a second term. Usually every Secretary General of the United Nations gets 2 terms. The only one who wasn't given a second term was a fellow countryman from Egypt. And I recall in a conversation with him, he basically articulated extraordinarily diplomatically, which meant you have to kind of read between the lines and between the letters, something along the lines of, if we dare to be critical of where we serve, what we serve, and how we serve, we have to acknowledge that we will end up very much alone. Because the act of criticism, no matter how constructive it is an act of rebellion. It is perceived as an act of rebellion. The act of criticism is perceived as an act of betrayal by many different people. And therefore, one is per definition putting oneself in a corner quite away from others. And there is very little willingness to stand with those who are critical, but critical also of their own. There's very little willingness. And herein comes another concept that I wanted us to consider alongside with resilience, which is the concept of solidarity. It's not kosher or fun or whatever the word is to actually speak of solidarity anymore, even though goodness knows for decades, it was what we did. It was what had to be done, especially in left-wing nationalist movements and national relation movements some years ago. And it seems as if this concept of solidarity has been appropriated by the religious right and the political right today, but they don't call it solidarity. It's called alliance building, it's called goodness knows what. But in the act of leaving that concept of solidarity because it wasn't quite as interesting, we have also let go of one of the key building blocks of resilience. Because to be alone all the time is a very hard sentence to impose on oneself, but also to impose on one another. To be in solidarity means that the courage that it takes is magnified, is amplified, and therefore the transformation that is being called for is possible. Now, unfortunately, we live in a world and in a context where if you show solidarity, you can get quite a lot of grief, as we can see from what is happening, especially ironically in Europe, around the Palestinian and Israeli situation. We didn't see it happening around Ukraine, but we most certainly see it happening around Gaza and the Palestinian question, which leads to my second point, why interfaith? As a person who's been working in this space for many more years than I care to recount, I can share with you very confidently that we cannot genuinely speak of, and I defer obviously, and I do apologize to my professors and religious teachers, there isn't an interfaith space, there's a multi-faith space. Most certainly there's a multi-faith space. But there's a difference between interfaith and multi-faith. A multi-faith is one where we all come together within our own distinctive identities, languages, discourses, actions, activities, commitments, etc., and we share a common commitment. And that's already a very big deal. Interfaith is the next stage, which is what Professor Lähnemann and many others have been trying to develop and have successfully, in some cases, developed the pedagogy for, which is the space where even the language that we use to self-identify is a language that is actually not necessarily intrinsic to our own faith traditions. So even the discourse about the divine, or what it is that we consider ourself in relationship to the divine, even that language may not be the one that comes from our own, or rooted only in our own religious tradition. That is to be interfaith, because that is to genuinely see ourselves through the eyes of the other, in the language of the other. Now, I ask you to imagine what that would be like, that we can actually self-identify our own faith, but using a language that others see as part of their understanding of faith. A very simple example, and it's very, very personal, but it is the ability for me to say, yes, as a Muslim, we are called upon to be stewards of this earth. We have to look after this earth. That is Muslim language. It's in the Quran. We're your stewards. But then, for me, what that actually also means is that we are beholden to nature in the same ways that we are beholden to God, the divine, to Allah. We are beholden to nature. Nature judges us and reacts to us in ways that the divine judges us and reacts to us. Now, that discourse is not part of the traditional Islamic discourse. That is the indigenous discourse. That we ultimately need to see the divine in nature. Nature is divine and is the many manifestations of the divine. So to be beholden to nature is a step beyond stewardship. It is the how of stewardship, and it is the deference to nature in the same way that we would defer to our Lord. The ability to do this, and to do this on many ways, in a professional setting, in a personal setting, that is what our interfaith is supposed to ideally lead to. So that it doesn't matter anymore how distinct our differences are. It doesn't even matter how complementary and how alike we are, because we are all one. And the language in which you will refer to yourself and your understanding of self is the language I understand and refer to in my language of self. That stage of interfaith we have not yet arrived at. But interestingly enough, and here is why I come to women peace builders. Interestingly enough, when you listen to the discourse of a number of women, now let me clarify, I am not speaking exclusively of women who are ordained in their own religious traditions. I am not even speaking exclusively of women scholars of their religious traditions. I am speaking actually very specifically of women who serve in their different communities with a passion and an inspiration from their faith, but who are first and foremost community leaders, servants. They are servants of those spaces. They work on a range of issues, from feeding to healing to being around to just different forms of service. And in 9 times out of 10, they are very unlikely to be standing where I'm standing now, or in a pulpit in a church, in a mosque, or a synagogue. They are likely, very, very likely, to be sitting amongst the believers. That form of servant leadership is actually a form that women have been forced to take anyway in religious communities. Not that it was a matter of choice, but it was a situation where generally women do a lot of the service and the cleaning and the administration and the management and the coordination, and very often the spokespersons for those very same traditions and contexts are the male leaders. I am speaking to those women, servants of their communities, many of whom will work in their religious community, but will also work outside of the religious community, serving anything else and everyone else and everywhere else, absolutely inspired by their faith, but not necessarily representing their faith and or implementing or representing their particular religious institution. I am speaking of the average, plentiful in number, women who serve in their communities. The inspiration to start unpacking this came many, many years ago when I first served Religions for Peace from 2000 to 2004 as a person who was putting together a database of organizations of women of faith around the world. In the research that I always had one leg in academia and one leg in the normal service space. So I was always trying to get some knowledge for myself and to share it with within my academic communities. Part of the research that I did from 2000 to 2004 focused on these different religious communities, organizations, groups, and especially on the women in those groups and how they were, who they were, what they did, etc. And I realized that 90% at least of those actually providing the services within religious institutions, communities, and groups were women. 100% of those speaking for these institutions and communities and groups were men. Now that, thankfully, has started to change, obviously. Now you see women ordained and in leadership positions in many different religious institutions. But at that point, it was a very weighted reality, where the bulk of the service providers, and these services are very different, were women. And the bulk, the whole of those doing the actual speaking in the name of and the preaching were the men. This understanding of the unique role that women play was also further reinforced when I worked in the UN, and I realized that so many of my female colleagues in the United Nations system were very much inspired by their own faith tradition. They wouldn't mention it, no one would name it necessarily, but it was understood. When you work in the United Nations, you're expected to remove your nationality the minute you step into the realms, the holy and sacred spaces of the United Nations. You're expected to not be representing your country. Absolutely not. And actually, sometimes, in many cases, it works. Because you're there serving everybody all the time, and you're board is 193 governments, which makes you not want to be serving any particular government or representing any particular government. Because heaven knows it's difficult enough to work with 193. But you could not expect that community to let go of their religious or faithful identities. At the same time, that conversation was never going to happen if you were talking about the usual health and education and sanitation and politics and peace building and that. We all speak about that in secular terms. But when the conversation would venture into religion and faith, it was unavoidable to see how many held their faith very close to their heart. And in the toughest moments of their careers, that is what they held onto and that helped them cope with what they were confronted. A lot of men too, but it was the women who were most comfortable to speak about it should the opportunity present themselves. Therefore, clearly, faith is an inspiration. Faith is sustenance. And it doesn't matter where one works, faith is a sustenance to those women serving all over the world as well as in their communities. So I started looking more with those two dynamics. I started to try to appreciate more what it is that women of faith bring to the space of peace building, understood, by the way, not as signing a peace agreement. I think we can all see around us that signing peace agreements is not exactly a sustainable way of coexistence. Yes? So we understand that it is actually about building social cohesion. It is actually about learning and serving to live together in a certain degree of harmony, but also coping with the dissonances and the disagreements that take place per definition, because humans will never exist without disharmony. That ability to serve the peace building space is something that many women are actively engaged in. Until literally 5 or 6 years ago, it was still the peace building space writ large was still a space where 90% of those providing services were women, and 10%, the rest of the 100% who were doing the speaking publicly, the presentation, the presence, etc., were men. But we started to see that change very slowly, but very surely. Now enter a meeting on a global conference at the height of COVID on women, faith, and diplomacy. And Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, Angela Merkel, then Chancellor of Germany, give the opening speeches. Both of them speak to the incredible importance that religion has and that women have in life. I sort of almost was tempted to say, I never heard Angela Merkel talk about religion before so publicly. I never heard Guterres talk about religion so publicly, but they both addressed and stressed how there was almost a seamless engagement of women, faith, and roles in the diplomatic world, and therefore in diplomacy. It started me in a direction of wanting to understand more what it is that women bring. And what women of faith bring, uniformly in different religions, is the ability to work together, to serve together, as well as therefore the resilience that they need to build in their own societies, in their own families, in their own communities. Now, I am not saying that women of faith are stamped peace builders and the best thing that ever existed. That is absolutely not what I'm saying. And I wanted to quote something from the other Lähnemann contribution from Professor Henrike Lähnemann, who speaks in her book, her co-authored, Remarkable Women. The title of the book is Remarkable Women, the Networks of Nuns in the Middle Ages. So both Henrike Lähnemann and Eva, I'm going to slow down. Thank you. Write about the diary of a Cistercian nun from Braunschweig, whose names we actually don't know, because they looked at her diary that they found bits and pieces of, but it didn't have the diary that they came across did not have the part with her name on it, so we don't know what her name was, but they unpack the stories that she shares, and it's an absolutely beautiful book. And it's a journal that begins in 1484. Now, what's absolutely captivating for me is, so what choose little parts of the journal to explain every chapter, to explain what else is going on in that context. But what I found very interesting is something that I think women generally tend to do, which is to be very critical of themselves and of one another. In a way that perhaps we actually don't need men to be very critical of us, because we do a very fine job of that ourselves. But the almost natural understanding that as a woman of faith, deep faith, I will also see what is less than perfect, what is not quite right, in another woman of faith or another woman leader. And I realize that actually characterizes a great deal of the human rights movement, the secular one. And it also characterizes a great deal of the secular women's rights movement. That the way that criticism and self-criticism and the criticism of one another can go to almost an extreme. So you end up so critical of that which is happening around you, of the order, of the way of nature of things, that you actually don't have an alternative to just critiquing what is going on. And that is one of the biggest Achilles heel of the entire human rights movement. Because remember that the human rights movement was also predicated to a large extent, the secular human rights movement was also predicated to a large extent on what women were doing around the world. So the very first human rights conference that the UN had was in 1974 in the context of a World Conference on Women, where the discourse on human rights was considered to be the normal, what we're going to talk about. This is what has to matter. Afterwards, it's been more and more recognition given to human rights issues, but it was actually women coming together from around the world that insisted on the preponderance and indeed the necessity of human rights as the basis of global discourse and conversation, and look where it has got us today. Here's the most interesting Achilles heel, was to note and observe how the ability to be self-critical, which is one of the hallmarks of the resilience that is required, can also be a very harmful act towards one another and can leave us technically disabled and encumbered, because we can't quite figure out where do you go from the self-criticism. Where's the next step if everything is not quite as it should be? And that's interesting because this isn't just something that is encumbering the secular human rights space. This is something that is encumbering the multi-religious space, where in attempting to avoid being overly critical of one another, we've ended up actually not quite sure what the total value added of an interfaith would look like, would sound like, and would be. And at no moment are we more confronted with this challenge of where do we go from here, in spite of having all the tools necessary, all the discourses necessary. Where do we go from here is extraordinarily visible today when we look at what's happening around us in different parts of the world, where the discourse of violence has become the new normal, where the discourse of hatred is the new normal, where xenophobia is not xenophobia, it's self-protection. So where do we go from here is the question that we're all confronted with. Now, just as we understand that there are some incredible complexities and challenges within the Women of Faith movement, we also have to look at the lights of resilience that the interfaith women have been able to build in concert with one another. I learned about some of this when I set up the Multi-Religious Humanitarian Fund in Religions for Peace. No time before had we ever had a multi-religious humanitarian fund. We got tons of humanitarian engagement, tons of humanitarian work, lots of money in certain circles for humanitarian actions, but there was no multi-faith humanitarian fund, which I mistakenly thought would be so attractive to religions and people to contribute to, and realized later that it wasn't quite as attractive because it seemed to compete with what other people are trying to do. And heaven forbid we should compete with one another. So an interesting entry point in learning was that out of the call for proposals that we sent out, again, we had this really interesting statistic that 90% of those who wrote to request support, and the only criteria was you have to work together from different religious communities, you have to be willing to do whatever it is together. We got quite a bit, by the way, from different Christians saying we're definitely multi-faith. This one is Baptist, this one is Protestant, this one is this, and that. But yeah, that's nice, that's lovely, that's not quite what we meant, but good that you have that inclination. We found that 90% of the submissions for or requests for money came from women of faith working together, interfaith women's groups around the world. They were already working together, serving their communities on a whole range of issues. They needed a wee bit of extra help given what was going on with COVID. And given the fact that very rarely were they seen as a target or potential recipients of this massive doses of humanitarian funding that was coming either from governments or intergovernmental actors or secular humanitarian actors. They didn't see this women of faith space, they didn't see it, and if they saw it, it wasn't significant enough because there were not enough religious leaders to talk about this, to represent this. Now remember, religious leaders in the traditional form of religious leaders meant who were religious leaders. So this work has been going on, in some cases, for decades, this interfaith work that women do, for decades, with their own reliance on their own resources, and they were now delighted to have an opportunity to ask for some support for this work when things had gotten particularly challenging under the COVID dynamics. 90% of those who sent, and we received over 100 proposals in the space of the first 3 months of launching the fund. 90% from women of faith groups around the world, interfaith women's groups around the world. We asked them in the proposal that we sent out to give us examples of what they did that would sort of, how shall I say, that would warrant that they could be recipients of the support. Like, what did they do anything before? If this was a brand new initiative, could they please just let us know? It's a very, very simple sheet, questions that fit on one sheet. And out of the 90% that submitted, 80% had been working already for some time, serving together in their communities. So nothing new under the sun. This work has been going on beautifully. And yet, not only were they not seen, at a time when many groups were being identified in the faith communities, many groups were being identified as necessary actors in this space. They were not seen, they were not acknowledged, but even if they were seen, the money needed to go somewhere more dependable, which is established institutions, political, financial, social, established institutions. And most of these women were not necessarily part of established institutions. They were just working together in their communities. Hence the idea that perhaps it is time for us to not only focus on the levels of leadership and the tier of leadership that we see within governmental, non-governmental, and intergovernmental dynamics, but to look more closely and more deliberately, and to listen more loudly, I would think, and I mean this technically, listen more loudly, i.e. listen better, to the work that women of faith do. So much of this work is unrecognized, does not get written, and doesn't get registered. And interestingly enough, when I did this with Religions for Peace, as now the head of Religions for Peace, when I started to determinedly put together the voices and the accomplishments of the women of faith, that was part of the challenge to the established religious leadership of my own board, who felt that, yeah, very nice, but surely we have more important things to do, beyond acknowledging what it is that women have done for decades, together to serve their communities. We've reached a point, I believe, in the multi-faith world where women's leadership is definitely oft spoken about. Women's roles, women's contributions, women's commitment. I mean, one must not speak about this. Surely everybody speaks it. It's deeply, deeply important. But there's also a significant amount of a sense of threat about this leadership that women provide through service and about the acknowledgement of that leadership. For most of the donors, that was another research that I did in the last 3 years, for most of those who contribute, who give money to the work of religious communities together in different parts of the world, for most of them, when they woke up to realize that, oh my goodness, the women are doing some amazing work, and it's not just today, they've been doing this for decades. They then decided to provide resources for specific women, religious women. So a bulk of the resources of the international community, so writ largely, for development and humanitarian assistance that is now going to women of faith is going to the Catholic women, which is perfectly fine and absolutely deserved, not the point. Then you see the other side with some work, some recognition, i.e. money, also going to certain Muslim women and certain Muslim women's groups who need to fulfill specific criteria for what it is to be a Muslim woman. I don't fulfill those criteria. But now the trend is, ironically, from not noticing and not wanting to notice, to noticing in very siloed, pillarized fashions. So there's very little to no support from the secular world and from the so-called interreligious world to interfaith women's service and servant leadership around the world. And there is a very clear sense of, in spite of the talk, there's a very clear sense of concern about what that might entail. Because what it might entail is, if we begin to acknowledge the resilience that women of faith bring to social cohesion in their communities, we would most likely have to completely reconfigure our understanding of our own religious traditions and our own religious discourse, which many institutions, including secular ones, don't want to see ever happening. Thank you.